All right, morning, y'all. Today we're going to continue on with our little talk about historiography. Let's, I guess, more about historical sources. I'm going to show you all a primary source and kind of how I would look at it and questions you should ask yourself when we view primary sources. That's probably the way that we'll mostly look at things. I'm not a big textbook guy. If you guys want to learn about a subject, it's extremely easy to just Google anything and just pull up information on anything that you wanna see. The real history and the cool stuff, in my opinion, is the actual primary sources, which are they're from the time they'd be written by someone who experienced whatever it is that you're studying. I did my research on the Irish Revolution in World War I. Was during World War I and a little bit afterwards, when Ireland declared independence from Great Britain. I have Irish ancestry, so I thought that was kind of a fun topic. And so when I did my research, what I would do is digitally access libraries in Dublin and then read letters soldiers had written, and politicians and their wives, and even just some political activists, and kind of letters they wrote to each other. And then I would study those letters, and I built a narrative from those letters, basically saying that the British, the English willingly sacrificed Irish independence in order to win World War I, was my theory I came up with after reading hundreds of letters from people. So today I'm going to kind of show you a little bit, what that was like, but it's not going to be Irish nationalism stuff. It's actually slave trade document from the transatlantic slave trade. So I shall now show you. First things first is we're going to look at this slide. Oh, damn it. Forget that when I click that button, it brings me all the way through. So remember all this stuff from last time, Persia acronym, GRAPE acronym. Okay, so questions to ask yourself, basically, when looking at historical narratives, which are, it can be a first person, like a primary document, which would be, like a letter or a newspaper clipping from the time, a letter written at that time, someone's diary of that time. But historical narratives can also be secondary sources instead of primary sources. A secondary source would be if I read hundreds and hundreds of letters about Ireland and the Irish independence movement, then I wrote a book about it. If you read that book, that would be a secondary source, because the book would be referencing primary sources, but it's not the primary sources themselves. I would make a list of all of the documents that I used to come up with the information and the ideas I did in the book. So if you wanted to use that secondary source, you could find the primary sources. And then if someone read my book and then wrote a textbook about my book, or added my book's information into a textbook, that textbook is called a tertiary source. But we won't be working with those, just primary sources and perhaps a couple secondary ones. So anyways, that was all complicated and perhaps needless, but nonetheless, now you know. So questions to look at when looking at historical narratives, which can be primary or secondary sources. I wish I could kind of write that in there. Primary or secondary. That's what I have to do, is figure out how to interact with these slides as we go. Anyways, so what you ask yourself when you're reading a primary document or a secondary document is, why was it written in the way it was written? Meaning, who wrote it and why did they write it? Was it a personal viewpoint? Is it a diary? Is it a philosophical worldview? Are they trying to write it? Is it like a declaration of something, you know, a Declaration of Independence or something like that? And another thing is, like, if you're reading a history of something, who was the guy? Is he a historian who's writing it? Is he a blacksmith who's writing a history of blacksmithing? That kind of stuff, you know, that matters. It helps form your idea on what you're reading. You got to know who wrote it and why they wrote it, always, in anything, not just in history. That's why I think that these skills will apply to your lives, because a lot of you guys are dealing with a ton of misinformation when you're on the internet. And so coming at things critically like a historian is a really good way to realize when you're being duped and when someone's telling you something that's fake, which is getting harder and harder to do these days. So you're gonna have to work really hard at it. But yeah, why was it written this way? Who can read the history? Think of the time period and literacy rates. If you're reading texts from the Middle Ages, the peasants couldn't read back then, and I mean maybe a couple, but the vast majority of them couldn't. So when they would write histories, they would write it for other philosophers or other, you know, elites, other rich people, or perhaps other clergymen if they were in the church. And so that would change the way they wrote the history. If you were writing a history to the peasants, you would talk about the peasants differently than if you're writing a history to the king. And that goes to the next question: who pays for the history to be written? Is if the U.S. government paid for history books, you can assume that they're going to favor the U.S. government. They're going to make it look like the government is a good thing, you know, did good things. That's why a lot of textbooks will leave out the American invasion of the Philippines and our subsequent, you know, occupation. America was actually the first place that came up with the idea of concentration camps. We put Filipino people in concentration camps back in the old days, the early 20th century. And, you know, you don't see that in textbooks generally, because they're paid for or subsidized by the U.S. government, and the government censors them. All books are like that. Every book is paid for by a publisher, and publishers always have an agenda. So every book has an agenda. For whom is the history written? Well, that goes to who can read the history. I guess I kind of mixed those two up. But, you know, is it written for the king? This is a good one. A book about the American Revolution is going to talk about the American Revolution a lot differently if it's an American book than if it were a British book. A British book would probably be not so supportive of the American Revolution, where an American book would be quite supportive of the American Revolution. So we'll get to this one next, but what I want to do right now is show you all this primary source. So it's called An Account of the Slave Trade on the Coast of Africa. It was written by Alexander Falconbridge in 1792. It was published in English, published in London, England, printed by J. Phillips, 1788. Now, if you were doing research on this, I would be curious who J. Phillips is. So you could do J. Phillips, London. And it's just going to be oh, it doesn't look like it looks like that's a single guy and not a company, which is kind of cool. Old school stuff back in 1788. It's funny that it says, oh, he died in 1792, I think is what that is. So anyways, this is the actual document itself. This is the way I would look at a lot of the documents from the Library of Dublin. Pretty cool. Someone has a job there to just take these old books and then take photos of them. Okay, good. So then you can go front to back. As you can see, it's obviously old. You can zoom in if you wanted. I don't know why that took me out of full screen. That's kind of annoying. Yeah, so you can zoom in if you want. You can zoom out. That way you can see the whole thing. By Alexander Falconbridge, a late surgeon in the African trade. So a surgeon. I wonder if that is the same way we use that word now. If he was a surgeon for slaves. So there you go. You can start reading books from 1792, written by a guy who partook in the slave trade. You can go up or down if you want. And this is how historians do their work. You look through this old stuff, you read about what he talked about, the information he gives you, and then you ask yourself all the questions that we went over. As you can see, it's quite old. Google put their little mark on there. Digitized by Google, original from the University of Michigan. So you can find any of this stuff online for free if you really want to look up. That's kind of what I do for a lot of my free time, actually, is research. Yeah, so that's the primary source. You can look all the way. If you were doing research, I don't assume you would sit and read this entire thing, although 80 pages isn't too bad. Anyways, I probably should have read this before I did this, you guys, because I'm intrigued by all this. See, a caution to Great Britain and her colonies. He doesn't think it's right to keep slaves in the conditions they do because it pretty much wasn't. We'll cover the slave trade. I think we'll get there by the kind of the end. There's always been a slave trade. Like every part of the world's always had slaves, but not quite like the transatlantic one. They weren't always racial based. So anyways, that's a primary source. Pretty neat stuff. We'll be looking at some of those. I'm going to find some that aren't 80 pages. And then I got to figure out how to get right into the slide I'm on. But yeah, we'll look at some primary sources that aren't 85 pages or whatever. But let's see how long this video is. 14 minutes. All right, I think 15 minutes is about as long as I want to go. So we'll stop there with just that analysis of that primary source. So just remember, and I'll actually put this up. And then if you wanted to, so one more thing before we get done. If you were reading and you're researching that subject of the transatlantic slave trade, what you could do is, a lot of people say Wikipedia isn't a good source, but I use it anyways, because what you can do is you can go to the notes and then look at you can look at these different sources that they cite, and you can get an idea. I would never cite anything from Wikipedia, but it will certainly give you an idea on what you're reading. So if you were going to write about Alexander Falconbridge, you would take this information and synthesize it in your own words and not copy and paste it. And then that could be what you wrote. And then in order to cite the material that you write, you could follow their citations and then read those sources. And if you're doing real research, they'll pull up a lot of good information always. That's one of the ways I did mine, how I found what I wanted to read. So he was a British surgeon who took part in 4 voyages in slave ships. He became an abolitionist, which meant that he wanted to free the slaves. I think that working with the slaves showed him it was pretty barbaric and brutal. So that's the source we were reading. And looks like he died right after, just 4 short years after publishing his works, which is unfortunate. But in any case, yeah, I'll just do a little quick questionnaire to make sure you guys were paying attention during this video. And then otherwise, that's it. Have a great day.